election of George Washington was weirder than you think. That sounds interesting. We got an election coming up. I'm down for this. All opposed? All in favor? The election of George Washington was weirder than you think. I'm interested. 22 minutes? Can we get you just put yay or nay? I need to see the emote. Spam the emote and we'll get a general sense. I'm going to make the judgment call. We'll start it, and if we don't like it, we'll pop out. 2.9 million views? Come on, bro.
First U.S. presidential election in 1789 was very different from the way Americans do presidential elections today. In 1789, there were no official candidates. There was no campaigning for the office.
Okay.
There were no political parties, no nominating conventions, no primary elections. The entire election season was very short. And the major issue of this...
It sounds better in every way. It sounds better in every way.
...election was the Constitution itself. Whether the very system that they were using as the basis for the election, whether they would keep the system. Okay, well, you might be thinking, why were they electing a president for the first time in 1789? Didn't they declare independence in 1776? What were they doing for those 13 years?
George Washington.
Well, they didn't have a president during those 13 years. It's important to remember that the United States of America was not originally a single country. It was a collection of 13 separate countries. The 13 colonies that were participating in the rebellion had each been separate from each other. Distinct colonies with ties between...
It's kind of shocking we were able to organize this ragtag group of different states to beat Britain. It feels like a random quirk of history that just worked out at the right time and shouldn't have worked.
Between themselves and Britain, but not really ties amongst themselves between the different colonies.
We had a lot of help. I know France
So
helped.
when the 13 colonies declared their independence, they did so not as a single unified country, but as 13 separate countries
all worked very
in
fortuitously.
association with each other, what we would today call an international organization, in order to accomplish their common goal of freeing themselves from British rule. There was only one branch of government, effectively, on the federal level, which was the Continental Congress. Although to call it the federal level is a stretch, because there wasn't a federal government, so to speak. Anything that the Continental Congress decided to do had to be enforced by the states. And if a state did not want to enforce it, they didn't have to.
Okay.
Some people at the time saw this as a problem, and they thought that the states would be better off if they entered into a closer union with each other. This was mainly for financial reasons, but I'm not going to get into that. So they held a constitutional convention in Philadelphia in 17...
Speaking of financial reasons, it is not super relevant to this, I guess, but it's worth noting, because I've been reading that financial history book, just how dog shit the American economy was when we first got independence. It's like worth like, I guess in my mind, before you really think about it, you just thought things were good for America kind of from minute one, you know, because of the bounty of the land. But like, the country was almost, I mean, it was essentially bankrupt for a very long time. Couldn't pay the troops that fought in the war. Rampant inflation on all the different currencies for the different states. All the banks essentially bankrupt. Yeah, it was just like really, really bad. It's shocking that we got it to work.
1987, in which they drafted the Constitution that we use today in the United States. Now, this new Constitution was different from the way it had been before. So under the old system, you had one branch of government, the Continental Congress. In this new system, there were three branches of government. There was the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. The legislative branch would consist of Congress, but now Congress would have two separate houses, a House of Representatives, which would represent the people directly, and the Senate, which would represent the states. Mm-hmm. And then the executive branch would be headed by a president. And then under him would be everyone who is in charge of executing the laws passed by Congress. And then the judicial branch was headed by the Supreme Court, and then there would be various courts underneath the Supreme Court.
It's crazy we're still running this playbook. I feel like we should just fucking switch it up every 30 years. Sounds crazy, but I feel like every 30 years we should just fucking mix it up, you know? Try something else.
Supreme Court.
Yeah, like a Riot Games patch cycle. We should have seasons of government, and we just patch notes. We like nerf judicial, and we like buff executive or something. And then next season, the president's super weak, and then we.
So one of the questions that the framers of the Constitution had to answer was, how are they going to get the president chosen? Now, one obvious choice would be to have him chosen by Congress. That would essentially make it a parliamentary system. Like in most English-speaking countries, there's a parliamentary system where Parliament decides who the prime minister is going to be, and the prime minister runs the government. The framers of the Constitution did not want to do that. And by framers, I mean the men who met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 and drafted the Constitution. They're called framers, the framers. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to maintain a strict separation between the executive branch and the legislative branch. So that was off the table. So how else could they elect the president? Well, one option, which is the option I think most Americans today would take for granted, was that the president would be elected directly by the voters.
I wonder what America would be like if our representatives chose our president. I wonder how different of a world it would be if the only election we did was for our representatives, and then we got a president. I'd have Tuesdays more free. You'd have one Tuesday more free. Every 4 years.
The framers of the Constitution also didn't like that idea. They thought that would be not practical to do that, and also not wise. So the framers hit upon another system that was neither of those two things. What they would have would be the famous Electoral College, this body of individuals who exist within the executive branch, so you don't have to worry about cross-contamination with the legislative branch. And the Electoral College's only job was every 4 years they would elect the president. Now, how do you choose the members of the Electoral College? Well, they just left that up to the states. However the states wanted to do that. If the state legislature wanted to choose their electors, they could do that. If the state legislature wanted to leave that up to the voters to decide, they could do that too. So the American presidential election has two stages. First, you have to choose the electors, and then once the electors are chosen, they choose the president. That's still the system that's used in the U.S. today. And when Americans go to the polls in early November of an election year, they're voting for electors. And then the electors meet, nowadays it's in the middle of December, and they cast their votes for president, and that's the actual election of the president. So what we call Election Day is actually the election of the electors. The Constitution gives Congress the power to decide when each of those elections happens, when the electors are elected and when the president is elected. Nowadays, it's early November and mid-December.
Yeah, it's pretty standard.
In this first election in 1789, the election of electors happened on January 7th, and then the electors would meet and choose the president on February 4th, 1789. So Election Day in 1789 was January 7th. That was what we would call Election Day.
Interesting.
Now, some online sources will say that this particular presidential election happened over 2 years, 1788-89. It's not quite true. The election was January 7th, 1789. It was just in 1789. Where that's kind of true is in two states, in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. They actually had a two-stage process for choosing their electors. They would have voters essentially nominate who they would want to have as electors, and then the state legislature would choose from a list that the voters sent up to the legislature. So in both New Hampshire and Massachusetts, the voters went to the polls. Polls isn't the right word. The voters went to their town meetings.
Can't we just like draw names out of a hat? Can I just keep it real? Can't we just fucking put every American's name in a hat and then just fucking pick one? And I don't know. What if it was every year? It's a different...
And voted for who they'd like to be elector.
Uncle Sam, like an Uncle Sam.
And then those names went to the state legislature. And on January 7th, the state legislature picked from
You're telling me in Athens they put everybody's name in a hat or an equivalent and then drew one person to be the leader? A latocracy. In Venice too, basically, for electors. That feels wild. What if we got President Aiden Ross? They pull his name out of the hat and now we're fucking rolling with that?
Among those that list. But in the other states that participated in the election, it was just January 7th, 1789. There were 11 states that participated in the election of 1789. Rhode Island and North Carolina had rejected the Constitution and therefore were technically not part of the United States and not participating in the election. In 5 of the states, the state legislatures chose the electors. In 4 of the states, the electors were chosen directly by the voters. And then in 2 other states, they had a hybrid system. Now let's take a minute and look at the states that did direct elections, because they did it differently in the different states. In Pennsylvania and Delaware, they had statewide elections, meaning in Pennsylvania, we're...
Okay, wait. I don't care about this part. I want this part. I want the major election issue. I'm just want to get to the point because the video's a little long, and I want to see what the deal is. I trust him on this part.
And this touches on
I want to see what the issue was.
Big issue
because I am interested,
of the
but
presidential
not
election
really in the mechanics
year,
of it, but
which
like what
was
happened.
the Constitution itself, whether the Constitution was even a good idea. It was extremely controversial in a way that I think most Americans today probably don't really...
Oh, dude, another thing we don't talk about is like how many people in America during the Revolution were loyal to the British. Like, we think of it as like everybody in America was like, yeah, fuck them. Let's all unite and rebel. But it was like 50-50. It's like there was a lot of people. Maybe not 50-50, but it's I think it's more than 30%. I thought it was like 45, but maybe whatever. Either way, it's a significant chunk of people were like, nah, dude. Britain's great. What are we talking about? And then also the people that didn't care.
Realize. But there were a lot of people who were opposed to the Constitution at the time. And the passage of the Constitution was quite controversial in...
I'm a 2024 loyalist. In 2024, you still think America should be owned by Great Britain. You're still fighting the good fight internally to try and get us back to King George. That's interesting.
Several states. Some Americans felt like the Constitution was a betrayal of the goals of the Revolutionary War. They felt like they had traded one tyranny for another. They'd gotten rid of the tyranny of the British Parliament and the British monarchy, and they had now were instituting a new tyranny of a new federal system. A lot of Americans, especially in rural areas and out in the western areas, were afraid that this new federal system would be opposed to their own interests, that the federal government would be dominated by commercial interests from the port cities, and would make policy decisions that would financially benefit the big port cities and disadvantage rural areas. In fact, this controversy between those who favor the Constitution and those who are opposed to it ended up making it so that New York could not participate in the presidential election at all. Because the New York legislature was divided. The upper house, the Senate, was majority Federalist. The lower house, the Assembly, was majority Anti-Federalist. So the Senate, which was 10-8 in favor of the Constitution, wanted each house of the legislature to choose 4 of New York's 8 electors. The Senate would choose 4, and the Assembly would choose 4. And that way, 4 of New York's 8 electors would be pro-Constitution. The Anti-Federalists wanted the legislature to decide on the electors as a whole. So each member of the legislature would get 1 vote. They would have 1 slate of 8. Essentially, they would choose them in a joint session of the 2 houses. What that would mean practically is that all 8 of New York's electors would be anti-Constitution. So the Assembly would pass a bill saying this is how we're going to choose our electors. It would go to the Senate. The Senate would say, no, we're not going to do it that way. They would pass their own bill that would go back to the Assembly, and the Assembly would turn it down. It went to conference committee. They argued over it, couldn't come to a resolution. This went on for weeks. Then January 7th came, and they were deadlocked. So midnight, January 7th, they still hadn't chosen their electors. That was it. So they did not have electors. The same gridlock
funny.
meant that New York had no senators because it was up to the state legislature
Deadlock.
to choose senators.
It's like Valve.
So it took them until, I think, the summer of 1789 to finally decide who their senators were going to be. A similar thing actually happened in New Hampshire because New Hampshire's legislature was also divided in a similar way. But in that case, the Anti-Federalists in the lower house of the New Hampshire legislature gave in and agreed to the Senate's terms. So New Hampshire did, and it was very close to midnight when they made that compromise. So New Hampshire
Midnight
did
on
end
January
up
6th.
participating in the election.
How crazy. What a
Now, this
patriotic
business
day throughout
of
history.
whether an elector was pro-Constitution or anti-Constitution, what was that about? The Constitution ended up getting approved in these 11 states, but there were a lot of people who were uncomfortable with it, and so what they hoped they could do was get a second convention. That's what they wanted to have. They wanted to get a second constitutional convention that would draft a different constitution that would be more acceptable to the Anti-Federalists. Barring that, they could, at the very least, get elected to positions within the federal
They
government
wanted to remix the Constitution.
and then undermine the federal system from within, and thereby prevent the full weight of the federal government from...
Wait, this is like Hamilton, but in real life. Exactly. I think this is a bunch of people copying Lin-Manuel Miranda and his amazing fictional story and trying to make it real.
coming into force, perhaps to make people disillusioned with the federal system and provoke them to agree to a new constitutional convention. Another thing was, if you get anti-federalists elected to Congress, at the very least, they could be...
I do think it would be easier for him to teach this to Chat if he was rapping. Like, I love his energy, I love his knowledge, but if he was rapping right now, I think people
clamoring
could
to get amendments.
a
Now,
little bit
when the
more-
Constitution was approved in the various states, the pro-Constitution people promised, which seems a little bit shady in retrospect, honestly, but they said, oh, go ahead and approve the Constitution now. We promise we'll adopt amendments later. So people were voting for the Constitution with the promise in the future. It wasn't really binding.
So they sold the Constitution the way that, like, they sold No Man's Sky. Or fucking Cyberpunk. We'll fix the problems in DLC.
Binding.
It was an early
But
access
with this understanding
Constitution,
that in
yeah.
the future amendments will be adopted, which ended up happening. You know, that was the Bill of Rights, which came into effect in 1791. But that was the idea of electing anti-Constitution electors. They were hoping that if you get enough anti-federalists as electors, then they could cause problems for the presidential election. Everybody knew that Washington was going to become president.
Yeah.
They knew that actually back in
Goat
1787 when they were drafting the Constitution.
Damn, he looked good in that photo.
George Washington was one of the Virginia's delegates, and he was actually sitting
Looks
there
like
in the
7
room
feet
while they're all
tall.
talking about the president. And it was kind of an open secret that they're creating this office, and George Washington's going to be the guy they're going to put in that office first. So the Federalists were afraid that anti-Federalist
viewing.
electors might mess up the election. And how would they do that? The framers of the Constitution created this system where the electors would vote for two people for president rather than one person. And then the person who got the most votes would become...
Can I go back? It's actually fucking insane that, like, a lot of these guys are really young. You know, the people that framed the Constitution, many of them were young. And a lot of them are wearing fucking wigs. It's like, what? It's so wild. The fashion was, yeah, I'm going to dress up like a... like, get this huge fucking forehead area and then get the... We should bring this back. We should make it cool again to have a giant forehead and then have hair this way. Gray hair, no less.
that anti-Federalist electors might mess up the election.
Washington was 6'2" at a time when the average male was 5'5". Yeah, he's a fucking Chet. Dude, he should have said, I declined the presidency and instead I want to be the fucking commissioner of a new sport called basketball and star player. He should have founded the first fucking... He should have founded the NBA. I know.
And how would they do
Washington
that?
a gnarly 3.
The framers of the Constitution created this system where the electors
paint game
would
would be
vote
crazy.
for two people for president rather than one person.
George Washington famously
And
loved
then the
black
person who
culture.
got
Okay,
the
relax.
most votes would become president.
Basketball is
And the
technically
person
Canadian,
who got
by
the
the way.
second most votes would be vice president. And the weakness of this system became apparent immediately because the way it's supposed to work is George Washington will get the most votes, and then John Adams will get the second most votes. Then you get president, vice president. Great. But what if George Washington does not get the most?
It's funny because I mean, we were joking earlier about the buddy cop system, but that's what they had. That's what they had, where your VP would be the person that like ran against you. It's just so funny. Dude, I gotta ban somebody. Vinod, I get it. Bro, I fucking get it. You don't like this video. Okay? So what you can do is watch something else. I'm banning you because you fucking posted 700 fucking messages. Bro, so boring. Falling asleep. Bro, I can't. I get it. I fucking get it, bro. I'm not forcing you to watch it. Christ. Learn to shut the fuck up.
Most votes? What if he gets the second most votes? What if some anti-federalist electors decide not to vote for George Washington?
I'm going to put it on 0.5 speed.
Maybe they vote for Adams and then some other candidate, just some throwaway name. They could
fucking learn something.
potentially throw the election
Oh, shit.
and two names and not designate which one they wanted to be president, which one they wanted to be vice president was a flaw. And people at the time recognized that as a flaw. So remember, there are two stages of electing the president. First, you get the electors, and then the electors choose the president. So the electors were going to meet and choose the president on February 4th. In the run-up to that Electoral
Now it feels
College
fast.
vote, some political figures in the country
Now it feels fast.
were trying to organize a system where they would make sure that Adams didn't get as many votes as Washington. And the most prominent figure
This is what
in
it's
this
been building
movement
to.
was Alexander Hamilton. He was writing a ton of letters to different
Hamilton!
people. He was not the only one involved with this. There were a few others also who were writing
Hamilton
letters
mentioned.
to different states, writing to the different electors, saying, make sure you don't vote Washington Adams. Make sure there are some guys, there who are going to vote for somebody besides Adams. So if you look at the results of the 1789 election, you look at the Electoral College votes, it looks like, everybody voted for Washington, and then a bunch of people voted for Adams, and then there were a bunch of small vote totals for other people. A lot of those votes were deliberate throwaway votes.
Bro, Edward Telfair voted for himself. I know that for a fact. Edward Telfair put one down. I think Edward would be good. I don't know, I'm hearing a lot about Telfair this election. I feel like he's got a good head on his shoulders. I know everyone loves Washington, but I think Edward's got some ideas that really could turn this country around.
Votes where they would have voted for Adams, but deliberately chose not to vote for Adams because they were trying to mitigate against a potential anti-federalist scheme. In Connecticut, they had 7 electors. 5 of them voted for Washington and Adams. 2 of them voted for Washington and Huntington. The votes for Huntington were going to go to Adams. They voted for Huntington as part of the scheme that Hamilton was organizing. In Pennsylvania, again, those
I'm sorry. So
to the vote
the scheme here is
for
what?
Hancock.
The scheme here is that Hamilton was worried that if everybody voted Washington Adams, it might be a tie or Adams might win somehow. So he told everybody, hey, don't vote Adams because we want Washington to win. It doesn't seem like that much trouble. It doesn't seem like it's that weird. It seems like everybody's on the same page. Yeah, we want Washington. We want him to get 69 votes because nice. So let's just set it all up.
Hancock would have voted for Adams. In Maryland, there were 8 electoral votes.
If I'm not getting it, we'll just watch the whole video from the beginning on 0.5 just to make sure that we really understood it. So let's make sure that we...
2 of the electors could not actually make it to the election. The Electoral College meets on a state-by-state basis. So the electors in each state come together. In Maryland, the 8 electors were supposed to meet in Annapolis to do their voting. 2 of the electors couldn't make it. One of them was sick, He had gout and therefore couldn't travel.
Damn.
The other one was unable to because of
gout.
ice that blocked. I think he had to cross either the Chesapeake Bay or a river, and it was filled with ice,
man.
and so he wasn't able to make it to Annapolis.
Man, did you know that the first election in America was strange?
That's not a fact.
Yeah, it is a fact.
No, because strange is an opinion.
Nope, it was factually strange. Did you know that, like, that whoever got the second most votes became vice president? Like, you didn't have your own vice
Oh,
president.
that's interesting.
And, like,
I kinda
people
like that.
wanted John Adams to be vice president, so they wanted to give him second most votes, but they were worried that if they all voted for Washington Adams or whatever, then he might win the presidency. So they had to split it and make some of their people, like, vote somebody random just to be safe.
Very interesting.
I thought you were making something. You said pork or no?
Do you want me to...
So only 6 electors in Maryland participated. All 6 of them voted Washington and Harrison. Harrison was Chief Justice of the...
By the way, that story you was telling about the guy with the ice, that was me. People were asking what I was doing at the time. I was at home smoking a fatty. I didn't want to go to the election because I thought it would be a boring fucking waste of time. So I said, there's ice. And they fucking bought it. I was like, I can't make it. There's ice in the river. And back then, that shit worked like a fucking gas. Every time you were like ice, they're like, well, that's it. Couldn't make it. It was the get out of jail free card. Anything you didn't want to do, just said ice.
The Maryland General Court. He was not a national figure. They voted for him purely as part of Hamilton's scheme to make sure that Washington came in first and Adams came in second. They would have voted for Adams otherwise. Now, not all of these votes were like that. In some of the states, the electors really were voting for someone besides Adams because they didn't want Adams. They wanted somebody else instead. I think the votes for John Jay were like that. I think the votes for John Jay were legitimately for John Jay. I mean, I did a lot of reading about this, but I couldn't figure out exactly for every single state what the motivations were of the electors. But if I were to guess, and this is based on incomplete research of the election, I think the election would have looked more like this if there hadn't been so much strategic voting.
So what?
Now, this setup of the way the
It wouldn't have
electors
been
would
that
vote for
different.
president, voting for 2 names and not distinguishing which one you wanted to be president and which one vice president, this continued to be a problem in every presidential election after this until they fixed it. And they finally fixed it in the 12th Amendment, where they said that
I'm sorry, but the whole story here is that you voted for 2 names and people were worried this would happen. This would be a tie, but even if they didn't do anything, it would not have been. The great story here is that fucking Telfair got 1 vote.
For president, voting for 2 names and not distinguishing which one you wanted to be president. They finally fixed the election results. Really hurt John Adams. I mean, he didn't have any expectation of being elected president. He, like everyone else, expected Washington to get the most electoral votes, but he didn't expect to get as few electoral votes as he got. And he felt kind of devastated by that. It's kind of sad.
Dude, what the fuck? Quit whining. Fucking whiny ass John Adams, bro. You got vice president. Who cares? You're depressed that you didn't get 49 instead of 32 or whatever. Bros, it's because your face looks like a baby. You look like someone used the click remote on a baby. Flash him to the future.
Because it didn't have to happen that way. They didn't have to worry that the Anti-Federalists would pull off a scheme, because they didn't. All the fears about Anti-Federalist shenanigans came to nothing. Washington easily got all 69 electoral votes, and Adams wasn't going to get more than him. There were enough people voting for Hancock and John Jay and Rutledge to prevent Adams from tying with Washington. So,
by the way, even if they tied, couldn't Adams be like, "Hey, I get it. I'll be VP or whatever"? I feel like there was not a big risk.
It's kind of sad how that worked out. But anyway, those are the election results. George Washington was elected president. John Adams was elected vice president. They both traveled to New York, which was the first seat of the federal government.
Not for long.
And were sworn in the spring of
Room where it
1789
happened.
to begin their first terms, respectively. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this election. If you're an American, do you think it'd be better or worse to have our elections the way they were back in 1789? If you're not an American,
I think it'd be better. It'd be so funny to have a Kamala Trump or Trump Biden in the same White House. VP. Anyway, interesting video, though. I do think he overpromised how weird it was. It wasn't that weird. It's totally doable.